Welcome to the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. I'm your host, Simone Morris, and I have a passion for empowering others to take responsibility for their careers. Yes, I've written several books on owning your career and am loving hosting this podcast. This podcast is for you if you're willing to make a shift to the driver's seat in your career. We feature leaders who inspire, empower, and motivate you for consistent career action for results. Please continue to join us every Sunday when a new episode is released. Let's get into this week's show. Welcome to this week's episode of the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. Today we have with us Bhavana Bartolf, who is the Global Head, Digital and Sales Strategy, Commercial Solution Areas at Microsoft Corporation. Bhavana has been with Microsoft for over 2 decades, and she is an award-winning leader, sought-after expert who provides visioning and acceleration for digital transformation for corporations across industries worldwide. What I love to see is that she's got a proven track record for building high-performance organizations with a focus on growing female and racial ethnical minorities in the workforce. In essence, she's dedicated to driving systemic change to create inclusive work environments. I am delighted to have her on the show with us today, audience. So without further ado, let's get into Bhavana's exciting career. We want to hear all the juice because, it takes a certain amount of stamina to stay with the same organization for decades and to really grow. So we look forward to hearing more of her story. Bhavana, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Simone. Really excited to be here.
Me too. I can't wait to dive into the conversation. So, tell us a little bit about I read your bio, but tell us a little bit about what you do today.
Sure. So it's funny. I don't know. People actually call me Chandler from Friends because nobody actually knows my job because it changes so much. But in all technicality, so I work for Microsoft Corporation, and in my current scope of role, I help kind of bring together kind of the technical strategy that the company is doing around how we technically sell globally, and kind of how do we bring the pieces together to enable our clients as well as our people in the field that are actually doing the day-to-day job. So how do we make our strategies real? I think it's kind of the simplest way in which I would define it.
Were you always a strategy expert?
Definitely not. I don't think I would have ever captured myself to it, but it's been a little over 21 years at the company. And so over time, I think I have, lived experiences where I have the bruises, the bumps, where I've learned things along the way. And so I think it gives me a little bit of a sense of credibility to be able to now help with some of that strategy definition, given that I've had the ability to experience it myself.
So what did you want to be when you were growing up?
It's funny, everyone asked me that question, and all I knew is, I came from a line of, in India, I grew up in India. And so I came from a line of doctors. And so my grandfather's both my grandparents are doctors, and then my father is a doctor as well. And the expectation is that we all follow suit. And the one thing I knew for sure was medicine was not for me.
Was it dissecting a frog or something?
When I had to do that in middle school, I was like, I'm out. But I knew that. I think it's interesting. I think some of my careers happened, very differently in the context of what I thought it would be, more because I think I focused more on things that people thought I couldn't do. I was curious to figure it out. But, I think it's interesting to see where that's taken me over the years.
So what was it? What was that burning thought that, okay, I'm not going to be a doctor. What will I be?
So, it's funny. At the time, it was more of, I think I looked at it as, I want to be able to do something that helps drive a change. And I say that I know everyone says that stuff, but I think in my world, it was more of, I was raised to do everything I could to give back, if that makes sense. Because my grandfather came from nothing, and he was a self-made man, and his philosophy, and I grew up with him, was you give as long as you can give, because everything you have can get taken from you in an instant, just given the life that he led. And so for me, it was more around, I've got to do whatever I can to ensure that I create, a world for myself and I'm not dependent on others. But through that process, I've got to be able to make sure I'm making a difference, because if I'm not, then what I'm doing isn't as purposeful enough. And it doesn't align with how I was raised.
So is part of your work around philanthropy?
Yes, so I do, well, not for work, but I do a lot in the community, and it's part of why I think I actually love Microsoft, because that's a huge part of who we are as a company, is the work that we do with philanthropy, just that concept of, we do a lot around how we give back into the community, and we give back into places that we have passion and interest for. And I love what we do with our Tech for Good work, where we use technology to enable, humanitarian rights, sex trafficking, really enabling the planet. We do a lot around how do we get technology in the hand of, women, so that they have a way to skill up and get back on their feet if they've had rough lives. And so there's so much that we are able to do with that foundation of technology, which is kind of why I think I've stayed as long as I've stayed.
So take us on your journey. How did you migrate from India to the US and to Microsoft?
Sure. So I think from mine, it was, at the time, I just kind of put it in the context of, when I was graduating from doing my undergrad, and my parents had lived in different countries most of my life as I was growing up. And so, and then, had done some of their graduate degrees, outside of India. And so I think some of that was an expectation, just from how I was raised. But at the time when I was graduating from finishing my undergrad, the US was where a lot of people from my generation were transitioning to. My dad's, it was the UK at the time. And then I know future generations, we've seen more going to Australia and stuff. And so there's been a mix. But it was the US. And this is, before we all had access to, the speed at which technology and information is today. This is when we still had those dial-up connections.
Oh, remember the modem? All I can think of is the Amazon, the sound. I can't even make it, but you know what I'm talking about.
Exactly. And so, through all of that limited research, my background had been in manufacturing, physics, and math. And so I decided to pursue manufacturing as a career and industrial engineering. And I looked up universities, and I picked one that was ranked really well and had a great program at the time. And also, for international students, gave us the opportunity to figure out how we could get sponsorship and support to actually fund our education, which is not usually, the case for a lot of international students. And so I had the opportunity to come to NC State. They had a great program, and they set up an internship with ABB, who I'm grateful for, because they paid my tuition and paid for me to be here in the US and support myself. And actually, it's an interesting story. I don't think Microsoft was initially on my list of companies, obviously, with my background to actually consider for a job, because I wasn't a person with a technology background. And somewhere through the NC State recruiting system, Microsoft found my resume and contacted me. And I remember my first conversation with them, when I was surprised, like, is this really, are they serious, or was this a mistake? And I constantly was questioning it. But when I had the conversation and I realized they were focused on potential and passion, and they really didn't, seem to be, anywhere as much concerned as I seemed to be in the fact that I didn't have what I categorize as a technical skill set. And then, long story short, here, after going through an interview process where they focused on just getting to know me as a person, I think that gave me a sense of appreciation, gratitude on, the importance of taking a chance in somebody. And I think throughout my career, I will say, at the company, I've done things I personally say I have no background in, at least earlier on, and over time, it all adds up. And I think that recognition of where my core strengths are and my capabilities, which is starting from a high sense of empathy and that core center of connecting with people, has helped me, kind of build a whole career at a company. And here I am over 2 decades. And I'm still here.
That's awesome. Would you say you're in the driver's seat?
It's funny right now. Yes. If you ask me that question, definitely. But did I somewhere along lose that and think I was? Yeah, I'd say it took COVID for me to actually self-reflect, and there's been a lot of learnings that have come from it. I think I learned really early in my career the importance of, being your own voice and owning it. And, throughout my journey at the company, I've done so many different things, and I'm grateful for the fact that while I've stayed somewhere for 2 decades, but I've had over, 12 to 14 different jobs. And so, and over time you think, oh my gosh, I've managed it really well. But the reality was I went where people wanted me to go versus being in control. And I think it took the pandemic for me to really pause and be honest with myself on what, am I really in the driver's seat, or am I creating a narrative to make it sound like it is? And so that's been a big learning and experience, and I've made a lot of shifts because of it.
Oh, that's so powerful. That is so authentic and powerful. Thank you for showing up in this way. I think it's helpful because you talk about the narrative, because we can create the narrative and think that we're in the driver's seat. So I appreciate that. And so how do you navigate your way from a place where people are wanting opportunities, experiences for you, and you're following along? How do you get to a place where you say, it's my turn to get in the driver's seat and navigate now? How do you do the pivot?
So it's interesting. I think one of the first thing was recognizing it, right? Like, so 2 years into, that's it, the first year into the pandemic, sorry. So it was 2 years ago. And I was working for, and I just have to put this in context because I think it helps, right? Because I was working for someone who had, been a huge supporter and sponsor for me for years. I mean, I hadn't worked with her directly that many times. And so she had asked me to come in and take on a really large scope of role. She worked for another female executive who, phenomenal, right? Like, really cares about people, gives an opportunity. And so she had also, reached out actually a couple of times prior, asking me to consider this opportunity. And there was a lot of strong, female leadership, and she had, other, people of color that were on her leadership team as well. And so you saw representation, you saw powerful women, and here they're asking you to do this. And so, there was no questions asked. I just took the job on, right? And I loved the job. It was such a great experience. But I will say, a year into it, and this is where the pandemic does help, is when I started to look at, so what is this role doing for me? Where do I sit in the landscape of compensation? If I take the time to look at the roles prior to it, and I always find the way to look at the best in every opportunity. Because in this scenario, they asked me some of the prior roles that I changed, it was part of a broader reorganization, and you're informed about the change. And I always have been that person in that context of, here's what I want to do in my career. So I did, once I started working at Microsoft, moving into executive leadership was kind of the journey I had been on. And I had created these specifics that I was looking to, skills that I needed, experiences I needed to gain as I kind of built my capability. And so when I kept getting reorged, I would find a way to try to bridge the gap or to make a skill set or an experience work, but at the same time delivering what the company needed. Not once in any of those conversations did I say, if this is what you want me to do, happy to do it, but this is what I need. I was raised, in that, and it's funny, I was raised to actually speak up for myself, own my journey, and be fully accountable for everything that happens, right? Because every time, my grandfather's whole logic was you always have a choice. So you can't say in a scenario, you had no choice, you had to do it. That doesn't actually exist. You chose the easiest path, was always his feedback, right? And so, but somewhere along the line, as women, especially, I would say, and culturally to how you're raised, you want to keep people happy. And when people need you, there's a sense of, validation in regards to what you can bring and that you're actually helping. And I think I mentioned to you starting off that for me, it was around making a difference. And this was my narrative in my head that, well, I was still making a difference, and it was happening a little differently than maybe I had transcribed. But, most of the jobs I did had never existed before. So it was a journey and a learning experience. I kind of took pride in it. But then, 2 years ago, as I was having conversations and spending time with some of these, senior executives, and when I was trying to tell them, like, here's what I need. Like, I feel like I've done everything for the company, but somewhere I think I've gotten lost. And it's shocking when someone tells you that was your mistake. Why did you just always go along? And why did you never actually ask for what you wanted? Because the bottom line is no one would have actually said no. And if they said no, you have clarity, and then you get to make a choice. And that was like a shocking thing for me in that context of, oh my God, I was raised with those, like someone actually gave me that foundation when I was younger. How did I go from that person that had that strong foundation to becoming here? And in everyone else's eyes, I was extremely successful. But, and the biggest thing for me was learning that it's okay to be impatient. Like, no one gets to tell me I should be patient and that it'll happen when it's happened. You should be grateful for what you have, right? We don't tell men that. People tend to tell that to women because they want to cater to your emotion. They don't think there's a necessity in doing that to men. And I will say that is when, to answer the actual question, right? So the biggest learning for me from that concept was, no is actually an option that you can always say. Because if someone really wants you, they're actually, 9 out of 10 situations, they are there to enable your success. And if they have that clarity on, this is what you really want, and this is where your strength really is, and the fact that you need to step away from something that's great that they're giving to you, it's actually, we're worried about everybody else, and what we forget is that they actually appreciate the clarity. They really want to lean in and help you, because if they believe in you and think you're capable of doing something, then they truly have a vested interest in you. And that was something that it took these leaders telling me that to recognize it. And I wish I had heard it sooner, or maybe had asked the question. And the second one that I always say is, and that's become my biggest thing right now, is this self-advocacy, right? Women, actually everyone struggles to self-advocate. Men just do it differently and show up a different way. But psychologically, as I've done my research associated to it, women psychologically struggle, and there are valid reasons to why we all struggle to self-advocate. But because it's uncomfortable, there's a confusion that it seems like it's kind of selfish. And then we have this fundamental fear of the unknown. What is it we don't know? Like, and that worst case situation scenario of, if I ask for what I want, will I get fired? I always go with the thing that nobody actually wants to put on the table, but that is literally it, right? Like, there's, yes, your word that they're going to be upset. They could say no. But what people are really worried about is, oh my God, will I lose my job if I ask for something that is important to me? And that's, no one ever says it because it sounds ridiculous, but that's really what we're all processing. And so over the last, so since that journey of the 2 years, I've spent a lot of time on trying to figure out, why is it we struggle? And it's genetically how we are wired, whatever we want to call it. So trying to tell me to be somebody I'm not, and work out of the realms of, be bold, be strong, all of that's great words to use, but I've got to actually shift my behavior and my true essence to do it. And so over time, what I've learned is, there is a little bit more of a straightforward way in how do we gain the confidence and the courage to actually self-advocate, and what is the work that needs to happen to go into it. It's taken me a little bit to go through the process of learning all of it, but now that I have kind of figured out, this is what's going to be important to me, and here's what we all as women need to start leaning into. And some of it is just, we've got to start asking for what we want. And that clarity is a good thing.
Listen, audience, I have been over here taking copious notes. So you are going to want to save this episode and go back and just listen and be blessed by what Bhavna is saying, because so powerful, so good. Thank you so much for this. And I want to go to the formula because some of it is in what you're saying, but let's talk about the formula based on what you've learned with these multiple roles and your pandemic aha. What would you say are the key ingredients for successfully owning your career? Is there anything you'd add from the conversation we just had?
I think I'd say the first thing I would say to folks is it starts with recognizing that you're worth it. No one gets to tell you, you can't, you shouldn't. You control that dialogue and narrative in your head. And as women, I think we focus so much on that negative chatter, right? So I think if we start from a place of you deserve it, you're worth it, and that, the world economy is actually built off of the unpaid labor of women. And I think the pandemic, we've proven that the world actually came to a halt, and it was women individually that stepped up everywhere, that here we are, the world started to continue to turn. And I think if people hadn't recognized it before, I mean, that's a big aha for me for coming out of the pandemic, where women have been impacted significantly because of all the issues with the pandemic and having to make big sacrifices. But that power of recognizing we kept the world moving. Like that is what we as women accomplished together. And so start from that place. So that means you have a lot of power that you underestimate. And so if you can start with that, then I think then knowing the importance of everything else I just said, from self-advocacy to owning your career, I think will fall suit. But I think we've got to recognize how powerful we actually are individually and as a community.
Powerful. Your episode might be entitled Recognize Your Worth. I like that. Because you talked about doing some research, I want to segue to resources. What are some resources that have been helpful to you in navigating and thriving in your career?
Yeah, so maybe a couple of things I'll say on that one, right? From a resourcing perspective, there's always a benefit in taking, I would say, one, I think taking time, I think prioritizing you over everyone else and making that time to do self-reflection. I kind of call that, rediscovering your soul, like your purpose, who you are. Now, to do that, you've got to ask yourself sometimes the toughest questions. Like there are plenty of self-assessment tools that can help you, figure out kind of your strengths, what works for you, what's important, because you have motivators, drivers, so take the time to understand you. My husband's a psychologist, so it's always beneficial having that, at home. One of the most powerful things he did for me over the last, while I was going through this mental model and journey in my head, was very profound context of what is my purpose? And I was saying a bunch of things, and he was like, because you say a bunch of words and you created all these narratives, and he came back and he said, no, like, what is your true purpose? Like, forget the jobs you want to do. If you, at your eulogy, what do you actually want people to remember and say about you? That was now, so that put me in a step back, and I was like, well, then I don't want people to say I was a great, leader at Microsoft. Like, that doesn't actually make any sense. Like, to me, it was that human connection. And as I was trying to figure out how to articulate that, I personally went through my own learning of my strength and who I am and why I do what I do is very different than what I'm actually doing today. And I needed to make some shifts and changes in regards to the jobs I chose, the team sizes that I ran, and how I wanted to show up as a leader, both, at work, in the broader world, and then most importantly, how my kids viewed me and what was I leaving from a legacy perspective and what was important to them. And that reset was very profound. Now, I didn't quit Microsoft. I didn't do any of that. But what I learned was I am who I am, and what makes, so there was that big mental shift of, I am not a Microsoft employee, like in that context of that's how my brand, my identity all sat. And yes, there was my career ambition, but it was still aligned to Microsoft. So I had to make that real big shift of Microsoft benefits by having me on their team. Now that mental shift, and that's where I go back to that recognition of you are actually powerful and you have something to offer, because we always underestimate ourselves as women. That was a powerful, I'd say, lesson for me, kind of going through that process. And that is something you have the resources, you can ask yourselves that same question. But that understanding the psychology behind why we struggle to answer that very simple question is helpful in unpacking and going through the process.
So good. You're talking about that leadership brand and really delineating yourself from the organization, because how easy. I remember being in corporate and for decades and losing my identity to the organization's identity. It's like, it's almost like you're brainwashed, like, all about the organization, and very easily you forget about you. So I love what you're saying about doing the work of unpacking and rediscovering. You use the word rediscovering. Rediscover your soul. I love that because it's so empowering. So good. Love it. Oh my goodness. So we talked about this before we came on to the interview about the book. So I'm curious, as you think about your career body of work, and you mentioned you're working on a book, like what would the title, based on your experiences, your insights, your ahas, what would you title your career body of work?
So it's interesting because we're still in the process. This is like, I think people have pitched that I should do a book, but as we've been going through the conversations, what I'm realizing is what I want to be able to help people know is that you've got it, so it's time to go get it. Right?
Ooh.
That thing of bringing those two pieces together, because we tell everybody always how to go get something, and we tell people we're trying to help people figure out that they're valued and they have some worth, but we've never connected the two on the formula of how we bring it together. And so I do have these 5 steps on what I kind of categorize as the secrets to self-advocacy and how we should do it, because I just recently did a TEDx on it, and that's what led to people saying I should really invest a little bit more and break it out a little bit more, because everyone wants to know the details behind how do we make this work. And so the interest of the book is coming from that point of view as well. But that what I've learned through it is the secret wasn't really about how do you advocate. It really is how do I help someone recognize the importance of who they are and that they're worth it, and what do they need to get ready to do it. And then the asking becomes easier once you have all the other stuff in place.
Because you have the mindset and the behaviors to go with it, then it becomes easier. Because I find some people, I do career coaching as well. I find some of my clients struggle with asking for what they are worth. So there's a lot of mindset work that has to happen where, you talked about self-advocacy. Imagine that whole exercise is a confidence boost. Once you're clear on your strengths and your why, and you spend the time on that, you sort of sit up straight and like to use the language you're using, you lean in a bit more.
Right. Yeah, you're spot on, Simone. I think you've kind of laid it out really well, right? I think that's a lot of what folks struggle with. And I'd say the added piece is addressing your biggest fear, like facing your fear and walking through it before it can happen. Because as humans, I think we have that voice in our head that that says a lot and is always cautious or worrying you or, holding you back from trying to do something, right? And we try to ignore it, but we really can't. That voice is going to always be there. And sometimes it's also that added piece of what is it you actually fear? And doing the preparation around working through that fear, like that worst case scenario. So like, as I mentioned, a lot of people worried about, will I lose my job? So let's play that out. If you lost your job for something that you should rightfully be able to ask, do you want to be there? If you don't want to be there, are you ready to find a new job? And if you're not ready because you don't have your resume updated, then update it. Like start working through, because that's what paralyzes us and gives us the inability to actually see our choices, is because we are stuck with that fear of the things that we don't know how we can control. So forget the things you can't control and focus on what you can. That preparation of, and then everything else that you said, right? Like knowing your strengths, working through the clarity of why you're asking for what you're doing. It's interesting. I have, this early on when I was a little kid, and as I mentioned, I talk a lot about my grandfather. He had asked me a very powerful question when I was 11, and he asked me what my religion was. I thought that was like the most ridiculous question, because I was like, I live with you, dude. Like,
you have a choice.
Yeah, I was like, I'm thinking, but then his question back to me was, why? And I was like, what are you asking me? Like, because we're all, we were born one, and we're all Hindus. And he said, and his question to me was really like, is that what you actually believe, and is that what you're choosing? Like, you're just choosing to go with what everyone's telling you to do. And I was like, I don't know. I didn't even know I had a choice. And that was what he was getting at, right? Like, sometimes we don't even think to question belief systems and how we're raised, because it's a cycle of what we've seen. And we may challenge and question the things that maybe we are struggling to connect with, but other things we just follow because it's not as challenging. And so in this scenario, I was like, I don't, but then his statement to me was this thing of, if you're going to choose, you really need to go educate yourself about all the religions out there. And here I was 11-year-old kid. So it's not like, and he was like, go figure out, do you know how many religions are out there? Have you read them? There's abbreviated versions, like, and then his ultimate statement was, and after you educate yourself, don't just choose something that someone else is choosing. So you don't actually have to say, well, now I'm a Buddhist or now I'm a Christian. Figure out what actually works for you and forge your own path. So that question of, are you in the driver's seat, and when did I learn the importance of it? I learned it at 11. And that was when I realized, oh my God, if I could get comfortable in the discomfort that comes with, the vulnerability of focusing on you and being crystal clear on why I'm choosing to do something and what is important to me, is fascinating. And over time, I started making excuses, because as women, we start life happens and we prioritize everybody else, right? We talked about a company identification, but I started identifying as a mother, as a spouse, as a daughter, as a sister, like as a friend. And you somewhere in the mix don't have time for you, because we live in a world of finite time. And so that recognition of, you will have a choice and you can ask for what you want when you know what you're actually asking for and you have the clarity.
Mm. Your grandfather sounds like such a wise, sage, mentor, sponsor. Does some of his teachings to you impact the lens to which you look for mentors and sponsors in your career?
You're spot on. I think that's why I was saying I am blessed to have had that strong foundation, and I still got lost along the way, right? And so imagine those that may have not had that opportunity. So I think my recognition to everyone is, it's tough. Whether we want to and we want to stay focused is not always easy. And even in those moments of time when you're in that driver's seat, life happens and you somehow, get put in the passenger seat, whether you want to or not, and you forget because you don't realize, because there's so much going on, and that it's okay. We have then the ability to stop, pause, and make the shift.
Yeah. Reset, pivot, do what you need to. Give yourself, I like to say, give yourself grace. You slip up and you find yourself back in the passenger seat, but get clear, or anchor yourself to what we've been talking about, your clear why and that driver, so that you can pivot back and it becomes easier with time. What a great interview. I knew it was going to, I had to say, shout out Laura, because she did all the legwork to get you here. And it's a wonderful conversation. I'd like to ask you, if people want to stay connected with you after they've heard this episode, how can they reach out to you?
So definitely you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn, and it's Bhavana Bartolf. I know I'm the only Bhavana Bartolf in the world. There's no one else with that combination of the names. So you can definitely find me on LinkedIn. In addition, I just did a TEDx, which I think will hopefully go live in a couple of weeks. So please tune in. And there's a lot more detail around kind of, I think, the specifics you asked Simone on, the formula around self-advocacy and my 5-step framework that I've kind of pulled together. That's there. And hopefully, I can get through the process of getting the book, done and hopefully written and published. And so I'd love everybody's support as we go through that process. But I actually want to hear from all of you on your experiences, your journey. And I think, Simone, you called it out. Why do we struggle to ask for what we want, and how can I help?
Bhavana, you are a wonderful human being, and you have touched my soul. This has been a difficult week, and this has been a blessing and honor to have you on the show. I thank you for the work that you're doing, because I do know that you're fighting for more inclusion in the workplace. We didn't touch on that, but I want you to know I appreciate you as a human being and you blessing us on the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Again, thanks for having me. And Simone, appreciate everything that you're doing to continue to create a voice and a platform that's important.
Wonderful. Thank you, listeners.
I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this week's empowering career story on the podcast. If you did, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. Wherever you listen to the podcast, be sure that you are subscribing and that you rate and review the podcast. It's so important as we continue to spread the word of career empowerment. In addition, you can head over to the LinkedIn platform and join the Power of Owning Your Career discussion group. There you can have access to the guests who have been on the podcast, as well as others listening to the podcast, as well as myself, where we can continue the conversation. I hope to see you on that platform. You can also email me at pooyc@simonemorris.com if you have a suggestion for guest or a message that you want me to hear personally. Thanks so much, and make it an inspiring, empowering week in your career.